All right. Does that sound familiar, Nitin?
It does.
Yeah. Well, we brought it over from WVOX. That is what's the name of that song, Ardina?
That's called Cruising by Robert Silverman.
Robert Silverman. We
right.
occasionally try to thank for that wonderful composition and performance. I'm Charlie Stern. This is 914 Wired. My co-hosts are Ardina Seward and Peter Moses, who is not with us. Where we hope that Peter will recuperate and come back very soon. Maybe even next week, Ardina. I think he's almost there. Nitin Gupta is a physician. Go ahead, Ardina. Why don't you introduce Nitin?
Well, we have, I want to say re-guesting, but it's not re-guesting. He's co-hosting again. Nitin Gupta, who was with us for a good while back when we were at WVOX. And Nitin is back. He's going to talk briefly today when we have a little tiny clip in the show, tiny space in the show, to talk about the new virus coming from China that's affecting babies. But before that, we have guest Steve Mayo that Charlie's going to introduce.
We do have Steve Mayo. So Steve Mayo is a New Rochelle resident. I've known Steve for a bunch of years. And Steve had a show on WVOX for a long time. Is that correct, Steve?
Over 20 years.
The Steve Mayo Show, if I'm not mistaken?
Well, it began with a couple of co-hosts, guest hosts, co-investors. You know, the first show you pay for, at least Ben made me pay for it. Best use of $150 in my life. And, it got me a 20-year sort of part-time avocational gig at the station. But I ended up co-hosting with my friend Lou Felicione, who's a good old boy, Italian community. He goes back to the Feeney Park days. If you study the history, if you listen to WVOX enough, you'll hear of Feeney Park. It's kind of like the Lower East Side of New Rochelle. So Louis was co-hosting with me when the thing ended.
So, Steve, we kind of rebooted our WVOX show here in podcast format. What I wanted to have you come on today and talk about. So, Steve is a New Rochelle resident, longtime politically active person, Republican. Steve has taken an interest in something that I happen to be interested in, which is charter schools. And there's a proposal brewing in New Rochelle to open a public charter school. There was an information session yesterday, which would be Sunday, December 3rd. I attended. Steve attended. Steve, why don't you kind of provide a little bit of background on this charter proposal, and then we can kind of talk about what we saw and share our thoughts on, what we observed there yesterday.
Yeah, great. Well, and thanks for inviting me on this platform. It's a joy to be able to talk to more than my family. They need the break. But Professor Ivan Green of Iona University, he's in their science department, was introduced to me by a dear friend, Assemblyman Ron Tochi, who most of you know or have heard of, longtime political veteran. Let me call him a rock-ribbed Democrat. That's a term they usually use on.
And not only a political veteran, he's an actual veteran.
And a veteran.
Yeah.
Military veteran, 82nd Airborne. Many stories from his military. But more important for our purposes, a long veteran of New Rochelle community affairs and politics, maybe even Feeney Park. He told me his grandfather actually helped pile the stones that made Kensico Dam. So really long history back then. A lot of Italian immigrants, Irish, and I do believe also African Americans building that great, beautiful dam up north on the Bronx Parkway. So he told me about this group forming a charter school, a new charter school for New Rochelle, headed by Professor Green. And we had a meeting at Starbucks. And, for me, it took off. It immediately resonated with me. I've a long time been a fan of school choice, and I have some background in public schools. I went to public schools throughout until I entered college. Good New York City public schools, and some of these are still good. But I also had experience on charter school boards in the Bronx Long story short, I sold my business and became active in the growing charter movement in the Bronx.
So
And
which charter schools were you involved with as a board member?
yes, I started with the John V. Lindsay Wildcat Charter School, which is still functioning, a great example of a high school. It's got two campuses in Lower Manhattan and one in the American Banknote Building.
Now, is Wildcat the one that hedge fund guy was involved with? Ivan, I can't remember the name. Carl Icahn.
Carl Icahn, I believe he was. I
Right.
believe, but he was not involved by the time I joined. I joined about 2005 or six, and it was just a remarkable school. It had a work-study model, internship 1 week, study the next, and I wished I'd had this facility around when I had my manufacturing business, but that's another story. But they were smart enough to contact the very big food industry based in Hunts Point, and they being located at the very, I guess, northern end of Hunts Point at the Bruckner Expressway. So I joined their board and participated in a lot of their initiatives, a lot of their fundraisers, very important to me, fundraising. But mainly I was just doing typical small school board matters, meetings, voting, approving, passing, doing some personnel commendations. But it was light. It was very light lifting. Left when I felt I had nothing else to add, but on good terms with a whole group of great people, former educators, former business people like myself. I then went on to another primary school, charter school, whose name eludes me right now. I don't recall the name. I was there only a few months. But my third and maybe most interesting experience was with the Bronx Academy of Promise School, which is located in Kingsbridge section of the Bronx. And very interesting place, founded by a ex-gangbanger, that's his own words, a real street tough guy, Michael Carrion. Very, very interesting story to tell he has. And he's since become a lay minister in an evangelical church. But again, the same populations throughout, African American, Spanish speaking, sprinkling of white, couple maybe of Muslim or Arab speaking. But again, I just got attracted to the school reform movement only because I knew the quality of the schools in these neighborhoods. My factory was on 133rd Street, which is actually called the Port Morris section of the Bronx, the southernmost Bronx. 132nd Street overlooks the East River. So this is South Bronx. 40th Precinct, if you judge your Bronx communities by their police presence. But actually a lower middle class community, always working class, never poor, but never proudly displaying their local schools. I don't even know the local school names. I do know that most of the parents were clamoring to get into either charter schools or parochial schools.
So let me ask you this question. So it sounds like you, somewhere along the way, you caught the charter school bug. You kind of saw what the promise of it was, and you became active as a board member a couple places. Bring this around to New Rochelle. Ivan Green is a professor at Iona University. He develops an idea, and he's beginning to make his way around New Rochelle to market the idea and to try to gather community support for it. How's that going?
Absolutely. I would say by any measure, he's doing fine. The problem is he began his open public presence in the middle of a political campaign season. And he contacted most of the candidates, most of the Democrats, maybe a couple of Republicans. And I don't think that timing was good because politicians, last thing in the world they want to do is take a innovative breakthrough position on anything. So sure enough, none of the
Well, maybe not during election season, depending on. I know Ardina, we get politicians on here, and they either don't want to say anything or they want to read their talking points. That's the challenge, is trying to get them outside of their comfort zone.
Exactly. And sometimes when it comes to charter schools, a lot of politicians are not in favor of the charter schools because it contradicts the principles of the school board, a school teachers union rather, and they're looking for endorsement from the school teachers union, so they're not going to waive in favor of charter schools. So how does your person, Steve, work around that?
That's the $64,000 question. If you're of that generation, that's the big question. So the politicians, long story short, would not take a stand, but the wiser, better ones, and incidentally, a couple of winners, said, let's talk after the election, which was my advice to Ivan Green. I said, well, we can't change the facts. I think we started, you kicked off your initiative in a political season, local political season. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's not going to happen again for 4 years. So it's going to be open season now, but we also have the gift or the curse of independent school board elections in the spring. So that may be the time to have the real kickoff of the MSLT. That's the formal designation of Ivan Green's STEM teaching oriented proposal.
Right.
So maybe his timing is okay. Forget the past season, it was wasted. There was very little publicity given. Now's the time when we begin in earnest. I think yesterday was a good restart. That was only our second meeting. But I think, thanks to your question, Ardina, it probably is the opportunity now to introduce the idea of charter schools with the facts, not with the rumor and the lies and the misinformation. This school board season coming up in May or so, that's when this issue should be discussed. I ran for the school board a couple of years ago. I did not mention charter schools because I was told by several people who supported me, I hope you're not proposing charter schools. I didn't think it was going to help at the time, and it's a long teaching period for it. So I didn't mention charter schools other than in passing and always approvingly. But I was talking about STEM, obviously, science teaching, and other reforms, better, smaller class sizes sometimes, and et cetera. But I think the time is now, and we've got a lot of time to get the facts out about charter schools generally, because there's a lot of misinformation.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So what is the timeline right now that we're trying to, what is the timeline on this charter school? Is he thinking about in a year from now or 2 years from now? And with when we're talking about like the endorsements from politicians, how is that going to help get that move that along?
That's a fine question. He has not shared the timeline with me other than generally, I know that these things, Charlie will tell us the facts, but I know in my experience, this is a multi-year process.
Yeah.
I do believe he's had a good start with the state university. You know, there are 3 ways to get started in New York State with charter schools. Local school board, good luck with that. State regents, maybe, I don't know. Few people know who this person is. And then through the state university. Fortunately, seems to be a beachhead of support for school choice, school reform in the state university system. And that's where Ivan has decided to take his campaign through the state university, whose blessing I believe he has. And it's something I'll definitely have to take up with at my next meeting with Ivan. And Charles and I were talking about this yesterday in his car. And part of the issue here, we need to build up our fact book, our spec book, our time frame. I know Charles is missing some information, and I, somewhat closer to the project, am missing the same information. So there's got to be some catching up. That's why Charles and I were talking about hiring a good PR firm or a marketing firm with some Spanish language capability, and soon.
So here's what I would say. Ivan Green seems to me a very talented Straight, he's just a very earnest guy about what he's doing. He has his head and his heart in the right place. He has the educational background to do this kind of thing. I gather that he's been a principal and he's worked in the field of education for a really long time. So those kind of ducks are sort of lined up. Where I think he's got more work to do is on community support. So whether he's authorized by SUNY, as Steve has suggested, or he's authorized by the Board of Regents, which are the two primary authorizers in New York State outside of New York City, which New York City does its own authorizations, he'll have to demonstrate that there's a burning demand for this school. That's the key to this whole thing. You gotta prove to the authorizer that people want it, really want it. And I think he's on the right track, and he's going 30 miles an hour. He needs to crank it up to 75. I've been to two of his public events so far. One was at the public library. This one yesterday was at St. Gabriel's Church, which is in the center of New Rochelle. And his theme is, look, parents need options. I want to open up a STEM school. It's a very aggressive proposal. He's talking about kindergarten through 12th grade. You ramp up over time. And he's got some specific ideas about what he wants to teach. He's got some statistics to indicate that STEM is not getting to all the kids in New Rochelle at the same level of success. And so that's the gap that he's trying to fill. Dr. Gupta, you're talking to a lot of parents, obviously, primarily about the health of their children and not about this, but do they talk about schools? Is that the topic that comes up when you're talking to parents? What do they say?
Absolutely. No, it is. That's part of the job of a pediatrician is not just the physiological health of the child, but it's really their everyday life. And so many parents, they will talk to me about public versus private schools, the locations that they live in, things that they are looking for. And so they know it is a conversation. And so right. I was going to ask, what are the pain points that are being brought up to endorse a charter school? It sounds like there, STEM education may be an inequitable education throughout New Rochelle, and am I on the right track here? Is that why we're looking to start this school?
I think he's looking to start the school. Again, I can't speak, and we should probably have Ivan come on the show. But the basic thing is he puts some statistics up on the screen that say, if you live in this zip code, here's the proficiency level in math, science, and English. And if you live in that zip code, 10804, here's the proficiency level in math, science, and English. And there's a clear disparity. And it's the same educational gap that's going on all over this country. And so that's what charter schools have been trying to do something about, trying to give these parents an option so that their kids can have what everybody else's kids have in the other zip codes. I can't boil it down any more simply than that.
So, Nitin, to your point, I had cousins that grew up in the Winthrop Avenue housing projects, and they were basically barely literate. But in order for them to graduate, the schools that they went to, rather than really crack down on their reading skills and their math skills, they just pushed them through. Back then, they didn't have a term for social promotion, but that's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And it jeopardized their careers, their incomes for the rest of their lives.
And I'll add one more thing to what you just said, Ardina. It jeopardizes their health too, Dr. Gupta. Because when you have education, you have options. The family's doing better. It impacts everybody's health. It's a great big circle. This is one story I love telling, and then I want to play a clip. When we first opened up the charter school in Mount Vernon, there was a kid, and there's lots of these stories, but there was one in particular where the kid had not been doing well in school. We determined it was they couldn't see the board. They couldn't see the board, So my wife, who runs the school, put the school nurse in a cab, with a couple of bucks in an envelope, and they went down to get the kid a pair of glasses, an exam and a pair of glasses. It made a world of difference. Just made a world of difference because they could see what they were doing, and all of a sudden school became a thing for that child. And those little interventions can make such a difference. And if I'm not saying the regular public schools can't do it, but many times they don't. And in a charter school, those little stories they're there. And I want to play a clip before we get too far removed from this. So this is recorded yesterday, December 3rd, at St. Gabriel's Church. This is a parent. Her name is Niurka Rodriguez, and she was there with her husband, George. She has a son in the second grade at Charter School for Educational Excellence, and she came to yesterday's event to provide a testimonial about her thoughts about charter schools because her son goes to a charter school in Yonkers. Let's listen.
He's attending CSEE school. It's one of the best schools in Yonkers. It's located in Yonkers. So the best thing that can happen to New Rochelle is having access, all the parents, to a charter school. And I know there's people here probably from public school, and they're always questioning about money. Okay, so if we put a charter school, we're not going to receive this fund for our public school, right? So it's always questioning about the money. But why aren't you questioning about the education of the schools that a charter school receives? Like, the education is another level. It's higher education. And what we want for our community is the best for our students, right? So charter school is the best option.
I would say, if I speak with Ivan again, Steve, get Niurka Rodriguez to come to every single meeting. Because that was
amazing.
That's a pretty good testimonial. And it's very simple. She's a kid in the second grade. I spoke to her afterward. She goes, we looked at a bunch of options, and this charter school was a great option for my kids. So we tried it, and it's working out pretty well for her.
And that's a great school. She's talking about CSEE, Charter School of Excellence in Yonkers. And
Correct.
Let me tell you, that school gets high marks. The kids are well behaved. They have been almost incident free at that charter school. The kids come out with a high reading level, go on to college, and they started from zero. And they've managed now to expand to the high school level. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful addition to Yonkers.
And I would also mention that the number of kids who come out of Amani Public Charter School in Mount Vernon are now going to that high school.
Right, exactly. And you should see those kids. I mean, I live not very far from there, so this is why I see how the kids interact with the public, and I see these kids every day. And just about every morning, not so much now because the weather's cold, the kids come up a hill, and they're all in orderly fashion. There's no trash being thrown. You don't hear a lot of noise. You just see well-behaved, disciplined kids with great posture, great uniforms, who are there in that school to learn. And the school has just done yeoman's duty as far as educating those kids. Some kids this is their first real opportunity at great education. So the school functions beyond school. They function as social workers. They function as diplomats. They function as family therapists, ad hoc, actually. But boy, I mean, if there was ever a model for a charter school, that's it.
In that clip, you heard Niurka mention one of the big issues that comes up, and it came up yesterday, which is, if we have a charter school, the regular public schools have to help fund the charter school and have less funds of their own. And that will come up every single time in every conversation about charter schools. And it's my opinion.
That's a tired argument.
It's total nonsense, too, because the dollars don't belong to the school. They belong to the child, and the dollars follow the child to the school of choice. How's that, Steve?
It's quite a red herring. You're absolutely right. Since the last meeting, we were informed, I didn't know this, that, well, let me take a step back. Ivan, great subject here, Charlie and I have critiqued him. He can take it. We're going to sit him down and tell him what we think. He belongs in this organization. He's a great figurehead, and he's a lot of intellect to lend. This is a big job, and to me, it's mainly a marketing job. Just the points you and I raised, and Ardina, I would say, from your experience, either directly or indirectly, are enough to sell this charter school. What we're facing is a system of lies, half-truths, union talking points. I'm not against unions, but I've negotiated with unions, and you have to match up fairly and insist on facts, not fluff.
Hey, Steve, let me interject this. At the meeting a couple of months ago at New Rochelle Public Library,
Yeah.
Ivan took a beating. It was like rough, and there were a bunch of teachers in there, and they had an agenda to clobber him.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to sound negative, but he's going to have to do some work to overcome that. There's just no question about it. There's vocal opposition in
They
New
were
Rochelle.
shooting at his feet.
Yeah.
And it's going to get worse. Yesterday, maybe because it was second language, right? Spanish speakers primarily.
Yes.
But anecdotes are everywhere around. We've all cited anecdotes. There was the lady in front, the African-American woman. She may be with Ivan directly or indirectly. She had an incredible story about her dear child who had trouble in public school, went the parochial school route, went to Thornton Donovan route at enormous expense, and she ended up in the public schools of New Rochelle, and the kid finished apparently okay, but with a lot of difficulty. Nothing sells better, you'll know in Business 101, than a good anecdote. There are a lot of these stories that have to be drawn out, and we have to make clear, Charles, if no one else is doing it, this needs the handling of professional marketers. They're available. Yep. We can also do it ourselves. I think most of us know what's needed, maybe just have the final product edited. But I just want to share with you one other anecdote. When I was in John V. Lindsay High School, the principal of this chapter, they had two divisions, was as they call him, a white cracker from Virginia. His father was a CIA agent. Somehow he found his way north.
The principal of the charter school?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark Donald. A prize. A complete surprise prize. I got close to him on the board. Unfortunately, he's no longer there. I believe he transferred to a private school in Connecticut. Maybe he got a lot more money. All I can tell you is one day meeting in his office for just a little chat, his attention is distracted. He looks out the street. This is the banknote building, which is about 5 or 6 stories tall. He's on the second level. He says, "Excuse me." He calls out the window. He says, "Carlos, what are you doing on the street? You're supposed to be in class right now." Carlos, there had to be a lot of Carloses in the school. The student body, there was about 300. But I was struck. Small class, large class, I'm not sure the class size is determinative, but certainly size of the class, size of the school, and involvement of the very highest leadership. He's the chief guy there. Mm-hmm. Proximity of the chief guy to Carlos and his type is, to me, of utmost paramount importance. He knows every student, knew their school schedules, knew he should have been in math or English.
Wow.
That, to me, is half the problem. And you can say, well, you don't need a charter school for that. That's true. But getting to that size and getting to that informality and finding a guy like Mark Donald, who I do not believe started out as a school administrator, that's the uniqueness, the cutting corners, if you will, the cutting across needless regulation, the informality, the goal-orientedness. That's what we need to inject. I don't think every school has to be a charter school.
That's right.
I think we have to accept that some charter schools don't end up well. Admit it. I don't want it offhand.
Joe Clark is a great example. That's how Joe Clark ran East Side High. I mean, Joe Clark had his detractors, but let me tell you something. He was able to turn East Side High out over so that it became the equivalent of a charter school.
In Patterson.
Yeah.
Ardina, I always say this. We got to do more shows about charter schools. It's a fascinating topic. We can have a lot more people. We get some younger parents on here. Steve alluded to it. in New Rochelle, it's going to be a story about Latino parents. There's a large Latino population in New Rochelle. It's got a majority position in the schools. And that, I think, is going to end up being a big part of the story as to how well this works. So I want to thank Steve Mayo for coming on here today and talking a little bit about this developing story in New Rochelle. Ardina, we got some good people coming up on this show. Do we want to talk about it yet? Do we want
Well, yeah, let the audience know.
Okay. So next week, we're planning on having Sandy Barnaby, who's a well-known social worker and local politico, and she's going to be coming on here. Hopefully, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on with the race between George Latimer and Jamal Bowman, which, as we speak, it was just announced today that Latimer took formal steps to file federal paperwork to declare his candidacy. So that is going to happen, and I predict it's going to be the most watched race in the United States of America. That's my thinking.
Yeah.
So 914 Wired, if you're listening on whatever platform, click follow so that you get the notifications. We'll be back. On behalf of Ardina Seward and Dr. Nitin Gupta, and on behalf of Peter Moses, who we hope will be back next week. I really hope he's back. Thank you for watching and listening to another podcast episode. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.